Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today as we look at the Department of Defense's human capital planning efforts. Unfortunately, because most of the federal government, particularly the Department of Defense, has done such a woeful job in this area, it landed on the GAO's high-risk list in 2001. After 10 years, it's still listed as high risk. Improvement in DoD's management of its strategic human capital resources is an absolute must. As the Defense Business Board pointed out, we have active duty military serving in positions that might otherwise be suitable for civilians. This could result in a serious misapplication of the special training and skills of our armed forces. In contrast, too often we have seen contractors serving in positions that should be staffed by civilians or military. The potential for waste and mismanagement is enormous when one considers the 718,000 DoD civilians and the several thousand of private sector contractors. Recognizing this, Congress mandated that DoD conduct a thorough analysis of its manpower requirements and develop a strategic plan of action for shaping its civilian workforce to address shortfalls in critical skills and competencies that affect performance of DoD's operations and the readiness of its forces. The analysis isn't about insourcing versus outsourcing. These are just planning tools like military to civilian conversions to ensure the appropriate element of the workforce, be it military, civilian, or contractor, is being used and that adequate oversight is in place. I believe this is simple common sense, so I find it disheartening that Congress actually had to step in and require this analysis because DoD paid little or no attention to something so logical and so critical as workforce management. This is particularly true in the area of acquisition management, where a continuing shortage of trained acquisition personnel impedes DoD's capacity and capability to oversee its increasingly complex contracts. As GAO noted in its 2011 high-risk report, and I quote, "The lack of well-defined requirements, the use of else-suited business arrangements, and the lack of an adequate number of trained acquisition and contract oversight personnel contribute to unmet expectations and place the Department at risk of potentially paying more than necessary," end quote. Over the past several years, Congress has provided the Department with various flexible authorities aimed at improving the Department's acquisition workforce. However, on a broader workforce level, we were informed last year that several significant manpower policies were on the verge of being signed out. But to date, we've seen nothing. Instead, arbitrary decisions are being made without sufficient analysis being conducted or guiding principles in place. As a result, the committee has included several provisions in this year's authorization bill to force a more effective human capital planning and total force management approach. An improved manpower requirements determination process should ensure that DoD has the right people with the right skills doing the right jobs in the right places at the right time. Again, this is just simple common sense, and I look forward to our discussion here today. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses for being here today and for their work. This is obviously a critical piece of the Department of Defense. Human capital is the most important thing in whether or not our military functions well. That is true both civilian and active duty. Here today we're going to talk mostly about the civilian side of it, but I think it's important whenever we think of human capital, think of the total operation. Everybody who's working, bless you, for the DoD should be part of our calculation. How do we get the most out of the people that we hire? They are our most valuable asset. Add to that the fact that we are entering very, very difficult budget times. Comparatively, over the course of the last decade, we've had a fair amount of money. You've seen the defense budget grow. There are challenges there as well. As it grows that fast, sometimes you're not as careful as you should be with how you spend the money, and I think we've witnessed that. Now we're going to enter into a phase where we have the opposite problem: tighter resources, tougher choices to be made. And I think what this committee wants, while we understand that you have to make those budget choices, and I always, as someone who has to try to deal with the budgets here in the federal level, I always love it when people say, this is just too important, cost shouldn't be an issue. That's a noble sentiment, and I wish I lived in that world, but we don't. Cost will always be an issue, but when you're looking at cost, you also want to make sure that you don't just sort of throw up your hands and arbitrarily go, let's just cut it at this point and move on. Try to be strategic in how we make those decisions, because a lot of times excessive cuts can wind up costing more money. I think that is arguably the case with what happened with our acquisition force, as the chairman mentioned. We did a pretty substantial cut in our acquisition force over the course of about 10 years, and when you look at the last decade of acquisitions in the Department of Defense, you see a very spotty record at best. Clearly there was money that could have been saved, and recapitalizing that force, getting more trained acquisition people in the DoD is critically important. So we have to try and balance all of those things. I know you don't have an easy job in trying to do that. I look forward to your testimony and explaining to us how we're going to go about doing it, and we offer any support we can give from this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here today. We're going to have a problem at about 2 to 2:30. They're going to call for votes, and that's probably going to bring an end to our hearing. So if I could ask you to please make your statements as succinct as possible, to give as much time as we can for questions, I would appreciate that. Again, thank you for being here. We have with us today Ms. Brenda Farrell, the Director of Defense Capabilities and Management in the Government Accountability Office, Mr. John Hutton, Director, Acquisition and Sourcing Management Team from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, Mr. Pat Tamburino, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Civilian Personnel Policy, and Mr. Keith Charles, Director, Human Capital Initiatives, Acquisitions, Technology, Logistics. Let's start with Ms. Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity for my colleague, Mr. Hutton, and myself to be here today to discuss our work on DoD's human capital management of its large, diverse civilian workforce. Strategic workforce planning, an integral part of human capital management, helps organizations to determine if they have staff with the necessary skills and competencies to accomplish their strategic goals. Since 2001, as you noted, Mr. Chair, we have listed human capital management for federal civilians as a government-wide high-risk area. Although some progress has been made, GAO reported last February the area remains on our high-risk list due to the need for agencies, including DoD, to address current and emerging skill gaps that are undermining their ability to fulfill their vital missions. Also, within DoD, the workforce-related issues have contributed to challenges in several of DoD's high-risk areas, including contract management. Over the years, Congress has required DoD to conduct human capital planning efforts for its overall civilian, senior leader, and acquisition workforces, and provided various tools to help manage the department's use of contractors, which augments DoD's total civilian workforce. While the specific requirements vary for each category, legislation required DoD to assess the skills, competencies, and gaps, projected workforce trends, and needed funding, among other things. The legislation also required us to assess DoD's plans, and we have responded to that legislation with 3 reports to date. Our work has found, in general, DoD's efforts to address legislative reporting requirements have produced mixed results. Today, our written statement primarily summarizes the findings of our September 2010 report and is divided into 3 parts. The first addresses DoD's overall civilian workforce plan. We found that DoD assessed the critical skills of its existing workforce. The plan discusses 22 mission-critical occupations, which, according to DoD, represents the results of the department's assessment. However, DoD had not completed 1, an assessment of gaps in the existing or the projected workforce, 2, identification of recruiting and retention goals, and importantly, funding, and 3, an assessment of its progress using result-oriented performance measures. For example, DoD's plan shows that DoD had started competency gaps for only 3 of its 22 mission-critical occupations: language, logistics management, and information technology. The plan does not discuss competency gaps for the other 19 mission-critical occupations. The second part of our statement addresses the senior leader workforce plan. We found that the plan identified changes needed in the number of senior leaders authorized, and at the time of our review, stated that it expected executive requirements to increase by more than 400 by fiscal year 2015. However, in a separate review, we found that DoD did not document its analysis or summarize its results. Further, while DoD reported to Congress that this was a rigorous analysis, we found that some components information was incomplete. Also, DoD's workforce plan did not assess the critical skills for its existing or its future senior leader workforce needs. Finally, the last part of our statement addresses DoD's acquisition workforce plan. We found that DoD identified the need to increase the size of this workforce, which consisted of about 118,000 civilians as of September 2009, by 20,000 personnel by fiscal year 2015. In the plan, DoD outlines its strategies for growing this workforce. However, DoD had not completed 1, assessments of the skills and competencies of its acquisition workforce, 2, identified what the appropriate mix of its total acquisition workforce needs should be, or 3, included information needed such as funding. In summary, Mr. Chairman, while DoD has taken some positive steps, such as identifying mission-critical occupations and projecting workforce trends, DoD has made limited progress, however, in identifying the skills and competency gaps that its workforce needs. Until DoD identifies the critical skills and competencies and the actual gaps and the root causes of those gaps, it will be difficult, for example, for the Department to develop effective recruitment, retention, and investment strategies. Thank you, Mr. Chair. That completes our statement. We'll be happy to take questions when you desire.
Thank you very much. That takes both. Okay. Mr. Tamburino.
Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. My name is Pat Tamburino, Jr.
Is your mic on?
It is. Yeah, it is.
You got to pull it right to you.
Okay, yes, sir.
Like some rock star, you know, where the...
Sir, thank you. Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee. My name is Pat Tamburino, Jr. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Civilian Personnel Policy, reporting to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, Dr. Clifford Stanley. On behalf of the Secretary of Defense, Leonie Panetta, and Dr. Stanley, I would like to thank you for inviting the Department of Defense to appear at this hearing today to discuss the Department's effort to enhance strategic human capital management in support of its critical missions. Allow me to offer that while our efforts in the last 2 to 3 years have resulted in steady improvement, such as in the management of our senior leaders, there is significant room for enhancement. I take seriously my responsibility to DoD leadership and the Congress to deliver cogent analysis and a rational plan to manage our workforce of greater than 780,000 employees. At the organizational level, leadership is relying on our strategic workforce plan to accurately map our current workforce skill set at all levels and to develop the tools and methodologies which will allow us to understand the demand signal for personnel resources, implement analytically based methods which support long-term workforce planning, and identify the strengths and weaknesses in the skill portfolio and develop targeted programs and strategies. At the individual level, employers are counting on DoD leadership to deliver career roadmaps which allow them to develop their functional and leadership skills in response to mission needs and implement corresponding individual development plans. To accomplish this, we need to leverage the successful workforce planning efforts made by the Department's acquisition community. We need to build upon the improvements we have made in managing the utilization of our senior leaders, and we must develop a DoD-wide implementation plan for an integrated total force planning framework. Over the past several years, the Government Accountability Office has offered very constructive feedback of the Department's strategic workforce plan. I agree with the GAO's comments. To address GAO concerns, I am working a multidimensional strategy, including expanding coverage of the strategic workforce plan from 40% to 80% of the DoD civilian workforce, defining the market basket of functional competencies that employees in each career field should possess from entry through senior levels based on current and emerging mission requirements, determining the proficiency levels each employee should have for their respective functional competency, developing career roadmaps that outline the training, education, and job expectations across all of the occupational skill sets, implementing common planning and forecasting processes and tools that drive consistent and efficient department-wide plans, and finally, tracking progress against the result-oriented performance measures which are identified in our FY 2010 through 2018 Strategic Workforce Plan. Fiscal 2012 will be a transitional year for DoD workforce planning as we implement this new strategy. In FY 2013 through 2015, I expect DoD's workforce planning capability effort to have matured to meet Congress's requirements. In conclusion, the Department acknowledges that our evolution is not yet complete, but we have a vision for how to meet the requirements directed by Congress. The Department is committed to enhancing strategic human capital management in support of its mission. It is a top DoD priority. Thank you again for your interest in this critical area and for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm pleased to take your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Charles.
Chairman McKeon and Ranking Member Smith and members of the committee, my name is Keith Charles. I'm the Director of Human Capital Initiatives directly responsible to the Honorable Ashton B. Carter, Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, and Mr. Frank Kendall, his Principal Deputy, for providing leadership and management to all department-wide matters for defense and acquisition workforce. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you here today. I am pleased to be here with an important colleague in our workforce efforts, Mr. Pat Tamburino, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Civilian Personnel Policy. I also look forward to working with the General Accounting Office as we continue to improve our efforts to strengthen the acquisition workforce and improve acquisition outcomes. I ask that you include my written statement in its entirety. My prior work...
All of your written statements will be included in the record with no objection. So ordered.
All right, thank you. My prior work in DoD included establishing the first acquisition corps in the Department of Defense when I was with the Department of the Army, the predecessor to the program implemented by DAWIA, Defense Acquisition Workforce Improvement Act. My return to the Department in March of 2011 is indeed an honor, and I look forward to serving the nation by strengthening not only today's acquisition workforce, but strategically ensuring the readiness of the future acquisition workforce. We must not only address the immediate challenges and risks, we must also ensure readiness of the mid-career acquisition workforce in the 5 to 10 year horizon. If there is one takeaway today, it is this: the shortage we have is in the 5 to 10 year horizon. We need to focus on that and fix that before it becomes a disaster. While action has been taken to rebuild and improve the acquisition workforce, significant efforts remain. Secretary Panetta and Undersecretary Carter are leading efforts to maintain a strong national defense while improving our discipline in managing taxpayer resources. The Department must increase its buying power and deliver on efficiencies and affordability imperatives while modernizing and resetting our military force. We must maintain a core acquisition capability and continuously improve the acquisition outcomes to ensure our warfighters always have the decisive edge. To achieve these imperatives, the Department must have high-quality military and civilian acquisition workforce and appropriately use talent of federally funded research and development centers, FFRDCs, and university-affiliated research centers, UARCs, and contracting support. Since 2009, DoD leadership reversed the decline in acquisition workforce by establishing and filling new capacity positions. The Department's initiative to grow the workforce is continuing. We have achieved 8,600 of the original 20,000 target in new workforce capacity. There are two parts to the growth initiative. 10,000 of the workforce growth is supported by the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund. We will finish this growth. Another 10,000 is part of the Department's insourcing initiative. We have completed 3,200 of this growth now. However, remaining insourcing will be on a case-by-case basis. Our growth to date is aligned with strategy. We have strengthened in-house systems engineering, test, program management, contracting, cost estimating, and contract pricing capacity. We have also increased the capacity of the Defense Contract Management Agency and the Defense Contract Audit Agency. As we complete efforts to restore size, we must place major emphasis on having a qualified and ready workforce. One of our greatest imperatives is to ensure the readiness of the smaller mid-career acquisition workforce to succeed the larger senior career workforce. Many in the senior career workforce are retirement age now or near retirement. The mid-career group needs the capacity, capability, and experienced readiness to be acquisition leaders and take on major acquisition responsibilities. We must strengthen the mid-career workforce through coaching, mentoring, and mastering practitioners from the senior workforce. We must ensure not only continuous learning, but continuous career development. We must ensure mid-career development which builds on early career certification, creates the next generation of masters in our acquisition profession. The Department's collective efforts to strengthen the acquisition workforce represents a sound and effective approach to reducing risk. GAO found that DoD's April 2010 plan addressed 5 of the statutory report requirements, partially addressed another 10, and did not address 1, which required input on statutory needs. Our next chapter of initiatives will strengthen our strategy, reduce risk, and continue progress to meet statutory requirements. We appreciate the support from this committee on the President's proposed fiscal year 2012 budget request to continue the Acquisition Workforce Improvement Program. We also appreciate this committee's support of the President's proposal to create a consistent 3-year availability of all credits to the Department of Defense Workforce Development Fund. We are very concerned about the $200 million reduction to the DOTF in the House FY12 Defense Appropriations Bill. We need full restoration, or we'll need to use the internal DoD collection process to obtain funds needed in order to fully accommodate the painful reductions of O&M accounts across the components. You have my commitment to make sure that these funds are judiciously used to meet our highest priorities. In conclusion, I believe the Department has taken decisive actions to address human capital risk by rebuilding and strengthening the acquisition workforce. However, we must apply lessons from the past and follow through with strategies that continuously build a high-quality acquisition workforce. Acquisition is a core function of good government and of national security. We must increase our buying power and deliver on efficiency and affordability imperatives while modernizing and resetting our military force. We must always ensure that our warfighters have the products and services they need to maintain this decisive edge. To achieve these imperatives, the nation and the Department must have a consistently right-sized, high-quality acquisition workforce. We must act now to ensure readiness of the mid-career acquisition workforce in the 5 to 10-year horizon. I thank you for this opportunity, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. We're concerned about some of those budget cuts too. Some the appropriators cut more deeply than we did, and there have been a lot of cuts in defense in the last year and a half that we have a lot of concerns about. Mr. Tamburino, what initiatives are being undertaken to ensure that the Department's workload and missions are prioritized, eliminated where feasible, are made more efficient to ensure that the Department aligns the right persons with the right skills at the right time and the right quantity to perform the right tasks?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. In our Total Force Management Plan, we are pursuing exactly that rubric. We are taking the Department's missions, prioritizing them, and trying to match them across 3 dimensions: warfighting platforms, supporting infrastructure, and people. For people, we have 3 choices: civilian, military, and contractors. We're trying to always determine where's the best mix, where's the best talent set, and how do we effectively meet the Department's mission needs. And the efficiency efforts undertaken in the past year all drive towards prioritization of mission, identification of overhead administrative functions, and other low-value work that can be eliminated so we can apply the resources effectively to the workload in the priority that the Department determines meets the national needs.
It's hard to do all of this. Like for right now, I'd like to have the lawnmowers cut someplace else at this particular time, but that's kind of the way we are. Thank you, Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, gentlemen. Ask you about the contracting out issue and the A76 process and sort of what goes into that, 'cause it's been a vexing issue for some time. It seems like a fairly simple concept. You make an economic decision, as any business would do. What makes the most sense, what's most cost effective to do in-house, and what makes most sense to do contracting out. Unfortunately, there's all kinds of ideological and stakeholders involved, so process become horribly messed up. Is there any hope that we can just have a sensible approach when it comes to civilian employees and fairly accurately measure, okay, this makes sense to contract out, this makes sense to keep in-house? Are we making any progress in being able to do that, understanding that a lot of what drives it, of course, is, the civilian workforce wants everything in-house, the business community wants everything contracted out to them, and they are unbelievably clever in generating their arguments as to why they're right. And I mean that quite sincerely. If you listen to either side, you are absolutely convinced that they are correct. How are we doing on trying to strike a balance there? And if folks at GAO have anything to say about that as well, I'd be interested. Mr. Tamburino, why don't you take a first crack there?
Mr. Congressman, thank you for that question. We recently submitted a report to the Congress on A76 studies supporting the lifting of the moratorium on those studies. We believe they're an effective tool for helping to manage our workload and balance that workload against our resources. That report has several ideas for improved processes on how to make that program more efficient, more effective, take less time, and educate managers how to use it. We think it's an effective tool to help us manage the workload appropriately. So we look forward to having continued discussion with you on that report once you have a chance to review it.
Okay. So you think an apples-to-apples comparison is possible? Because that's always one of the difficulties there. Because, contractors do things differently than, civilian workforce.
So I think the department's efforts are to make sure that those efforts which are inherently governmental, closely inherently governmental, or efforts that are inappropriate to do in the private sector for other regulatory reasons are in fact presented as opportunities for insourcing. When that's not true, we look at where's the best place to get that work done at the most efficient cost. And when it's outsourced, we apply the federal acquisition regulations and related. I think our report offers some ideas on how we can do that more efficiently and effectively, because it is a good tool for managers to use.
Sounds good. Mr. Hutton, do you want to?
Yes, I'd like to say that at first you want to know what your total force is. You want to know what the mix should be. But to do that, you have to know what your current capacity is. What are people, whether it be civilian, military, what kind of things are they actually doing? What are their competencies? But just as importantly, to what extent are you relying on contractors for activities as well? And when you break it down to looking at what are the contractors doing, in particular the total force workforce mix, that was one of the points we made in a report last in September, that just with respect to acquisition workforce, there was a focus on the civilian but not the entire total force. And that would be something that we would hope to see as we move forward with their next plan and when we review that plan. But there are various tools the government can use to get better insights on how they're using contractors. And Congress has been encouraging DOD for several years to come up with these inventories of their service contracts. And we've been reporting on that for the last couple of years. We've identified issues of just the nature of collecting that kind of information so you know what they're doing and what you're actually paying for those activities. But there's also requirements for them to review those inventories and make these independent decisions as to what are the contractors doing. Are they doing activities that we're comfortable with? Are they doing things that we're concerned about because they're inherently governmental? Are they doing things that are closely supporting inherently governmental functions? Because all those things present risks to the government.
Thank you. One final, hopefully quick question. There's you have instances where active duty, in most cases, or civilian personnel go from being, either active duty or civilian personnel to contractor. And, we've heard this complaint from our constituents. I don't know if it's an urban myth or not, that, you're not saving any money. You have a guy who's doing the job, for a lower salary, gets there 20 years, retires, starts getting paid that, and then turns right around the next day and becomes a contractor at a higher level, and not necessarily the exact same job. But there is no question that there are a fair number of people, on the active duty side in particular, who have gone from being active duty to being contractors, obviously bringing similar skills to the table, and it just seems like you're paying more at that point. Is that a problem, or is that just something that, shows up in an anecdote or two? Mr. Tamburino, if you want to.
Mr. Congressman, thank you for that question. In terms of, I can address that particular issue, but in terms of contracted services, our approach is we do not buy individual people, or we do not buy employees specifically. We buy work. We evaluate the competitive nature of the effort based on the work that's going to be performed for us, and that is what guides our selection processes. As to your specific question, I couldn't answer that without additional research.
Okay. Anybody got anything beyond that? If not, that's...
I think from a GAO perspective, one of the important things we would want, that if there was a decision that to provide this service is going to be provided by a contractor, that that the government gets a good outcome, and that requires sufficient acquisition workforce staff to make sure that they do a sound business arrangement, that they have the sufficient oversight to make sure that the contractor performs as the contract would specify. What you point out are things that I've heard as well, but I don't have any empirical data or other further analysis.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Parkinson was a very keen observer of human behavior, particularly in the workforce. He observed, for instance, that work expands to fill the time available for its completion. I think you could have no better example of that than the U.S. Congress. He also noted that as an organization grew, more and more of its energies were consumed with internal communication. The larger the organization got, the more of their energies were consumed with communicating with each other. And finally, at some point, a different point depending upon the kind of organization it was, essentially all of their energies were consumed with internal communication. They got little or nothing done. How far is DOD along this continuum? They are really big and really complex. Is it closer to 25%, 50%, 75%? I'd just like for you to get on the line and each of you tell me how far you think DOD is along this continuum.
I think from a GAO perspective, we would be looking at how much attention has top leadership paid to strategic human capital management. And although it is cited in the 2010 QDR of DOD that strategic human capital management is of growing interest and a recognition that civilians are part of the total force, we do not see much communication throughout DOD about that attention of what is it. The plan is another example. DOD has been working on this plan for several years, but it's still not complete. I don't know if that's due to a lack of communication within, but as an outsider, there doesn't seem to be the attention at the leadership level to drive forward with the efforts needed to finish this workforce plan.
Likewise, a GAO auditor, I'm driven by data, and when I tackle a problem, the first thing I want to know is what's the condition, and that would entail what are we doing, what types of activities what are we doing, who's doing it, are we doing it well, what types of competencies and skills do we need, and carrying it forward. But until you have that foundation and baseline, it's hard to make some kind of comparison like that. So that would be my answer.
Mr. Congressman, I think it is a priority for DOD, and it has the attention of senior leadership such as Dr. Stanley. We are creating a total force rubric to guide us in the next budget cycle. In our efficiency reviews over the past year, a lot of emphasis was placed on low-value added activities, overhead and administrative burden, and calibrating our workforce accordingly. And we have reinvigorated the functional community management discipline inside of DoD, so I have a senior person at the executive level responsible for every major occupational series in DoD now, and I'm working with them individually to build the plan for your community, because I do agree with the GAO. This has taken us a long time, and we need to do much better, and we're committed to doing much better.
Mr. Bartlett, I would suggest to you that I honestly believe in what I do and what my organization does, that it does not exceed more than 25% of non-productive spinning around in circles. I truly believe we do 75% of real work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kissel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you guys for being with us today. Ms. Farrell, you were talking about early on in high-risk job classifications, that only 3 out of 22 categories. Can you expand on that a little bit? What define high risk? The 3 out of 22. What are the other 19? How have we gotten here or not gotten here?
Okay, I believe there's a couple of questions in there. One, I want to make it clear that the high-risk list that I referred to is GAO's high-risk list that we started in 1990, where we surveyed programs or agencies that were subject to fraud, waste, and abuse. And then later on, we enhanced that criteria to include areas of concern that needed transformation in order to be more cost-effective or efficient.
So the reason they got on this list of being high risk is because great concern as to how the job was being done.
The reason that strategic human capital management was put on the list originally was due to lack of leadership over strategic human capital planning, that we felt there was a lack of leadership in terms of looking toward the future of exactly what skills would be necessary. There were also issues regarding developing a results-oriented culture, that you would have a line of sight of what the individual did was aligned with the organization's goals. In February of this past year, GAO shortened the reasons that strategic human capital management was on our high-risk list to acknowledging there's been significant improvements. Congress has passed legislation, for example, regarding telework. OPM has put out guidance regarding human capital flexibilities to help the agencies understand what tools were already at their disposals. But we still felt that there was a need for agencies, including DoD, and the acquisition workforce in particular was highlighted in our February report, that they needed to do a better job of gap analysis. In other words, determining what your needs are today, if there's any gaps in those needs today, what your needs are for the future, and if there's any gaps. And by gaps, it's not just the numbers. The numbers obviously are important. It's important to project the trends and know what your retention and your attrition rates are, but it's also important to know that you have a workforce composed of the right skills that you need. There have been emerging needs that we've seen develop in the last decade. When you look at the medical, it's in the paper every day about traumatic brain injury, and DoD obviously has a need for medical providers to take care and do research in that area. What we wish for DoD to do, as well as Congress, it's in line, the same criteria that we're looking at for workforce plans are actually outlined in the legislative requirements for DoD to do a better job of determining what their needs are today and associated gaps as well as.
And what was the 3 out of 22 number?
Those are the 22 what DoD has termed mission critical occupations. They're very general categories that within them contain a range of specific occupations. One is financial management, another could be medical. One is, in addition to the 22 I mentioned, acquisition management has 2 functional areas itself. These are occupations that DoD feels that it needs to do its mission. And what we're saying is, when we looked at their plan of last fall, and the next plan's coming, so we're hoping to see progress, they had identified 22 mission critical occupations. That's the start. What's your need? But of those 22, they'd only done gap analysis, started those. At the time of our review, they were not completed for 3.
Do you have concerns about, okay, we've identified 22 and we've got progress on 3. Do you think we've picked the right 3, or do you have concerns about how we go about picking this, or is this the 3 the path of least resistance, and maybe there's 2 or 3 others that we should have done first and didn't do? How would you assess the 3 that were chosen versus the process of the 19 that haven't been done yet?
Well, we would say all 22. If they feel that 22 mission critical occupations currently exist with the skills and competencies that their workforce needs, we would want to see all 22 completed. Now, they can prioritize that and have a plan, and I believe they do have a plan. It's just that it's going to take years, whereas we would like to see more of a, how can you go ahead and complete this earlier?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Charles, if I could direct a number of questions to you, I'll just make a statement, then the questions, and let you respond. In April, I guess, of 2010, the workforce strategy indicated that DOD intended to grow its workforce by some 20,000 individuals through 2015 through a combination of half new hires, half insourcing functions that were currently being performed by contractor personnel. Since the report was issued, though, the Secretary has announced the limit to DOD's budget growth and announced that insourcing decisions are now going to be made on a case-by-case basis. Number one, is DOD's intention to still grow its acquisition force by 20,000? If not, what growth do you anticipate? Number two, is there enough funds budgeted to sustain the growth? And what is the current status of DOD's insourcing initiative? I know some of my colleagues have already addressed it, but I'd be interested in knowing what factors led to the Secretary's decision to limit insourcing efforts.
Well, let me start from the beginning. With regard to the civilian workforce, we have 152,000 people in our workforce now. That's 134,000 civilians and 18,000 military. That number is what we wanted to have at this stage of where we are. It varies a lot. It varies a lot military and civilian, especially since we're in more than one armed conflict and we're doing rotations with military a lot, and therefore that puts more pressure on the civilians and more pressure on the uniformed as well. So we don't have a magic solution, and we don't spin a bottle and say this is the direction we're going to go at this time. We have plans. If we can execute them, we do. If we don't have the assets to execute, then we can't. It's a difficult problem.
So do you or don't you anticipate continuing growth through 2015?
We are going to continue growth, but it's not going to be at the rate that we've done so far.
And is that for budgetary reasons, or? It's
for budgetary reasons. It's for consumption of people reasons, both military and civilian.
And could you just touch on what factors led to the Secretary's decision to limit insourcing efforts?
Well, I can't really speak for the Secretary, but I believe that part of the reason for that is financial.
That's all.
Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The work that Congressman Conaway and I and our colleagues did on the Defense Acquisition Reform Panel made me want to come here today because the work that you ladies and gentlemen are doing is so important. To put this in some perspective, the United States Department of Defense acquisition workforce will buy more goods and services this year than most of our state governments combined. Most of our state governments combined. To put it in further perspective, if they could improve their performance and we could improve our system to the point where we have a 5% savings in acquisition, you know, the person getting a Sam's Club membership or person being a little more careful by clipping coupons, if we could get a 5% improvement in acquisition, over 10 years that would amount to about 10% of the budget savings that the congressional leadership and the President are looking for at the meetings at the White House this afternoon. This is a big deal. And one thing that Mr. Conaway and I found is that we could write all the good laws we wanted, design all the good systems we wanted, and crack down on all the fraud we wanted, but we didn't. But if we didn't have really talented, well-trained, well-compensated, well-motivated people in the acquisition reform, in the acquisition workforce, this all wouldn't work. So I'm very interested on page 12 of the GAO document for today. Ms. Farrell and Mr. Hutton reported that in September of this year, they're going to give us another update on the issues of the critical skills and competencies of the civilian workforce and gaps in that workforce. Now, not to get ahead of our September review, but if you had to name, let's say, 2 critical areas of gaps in the acquisition workforce, in other words, we're missing people with skills A or B, what would those 2 most glaring areas be?
Thank you, Mr. Andrews. And I had the pleasure of testifying before your panel. But if I
did a very good job,
I'd like to offer 3.
That's even better.
One would be expertise in the area of pricing. I might look at the actual contracting function and the associated activities that go along with that. And the third, gosh, I know I had 3. Things like systems engineers and things like that are going to help with the acquisition.
Let's briefly walk through those 3 things. What do you mean when you say pricing? Do you mean people with experience in a given marketplace who could tell a good deal from a bad one?
I would say that. Also, you have the auditors like DCMA, DCAA that provide a function to support the acquisition community, whether it be in contract administration or in supporting a contracting officer and things like looking at proposals and doing analyses of the contractor's proposals and things like that. That auditing function.
What about pricing information? One of the astonishing anecdotes which came out of our review was that the Navy had bought a refrigeration system for, I want to say, $14,000, and 18 months later bought precisely the same system for $37,000. And the main reason was that the acquisition official did not have a database in front of him or her that let them see what we had paid for it a year and a half ago. Have we made strides in improving transparency of that information for our buyers and decision makers?
I can't speak to that specific issue, but I do believe that if that was a recent example, and given the challenges the acquisition workforce has across the board, I would suspect that if there was any progress, it was incremental.
Now, when you say contracting functions, what does that mean? Does it mean access to lawyers who know how to draft good contracts? What does that mean?
I'm thinking of things like the contracting officers, contract specialists, people that support the development of things like statement of work and some of the contract administration functions.
And finally, let me ask you, one of the things we wanted to do is create a career path for our uniformed personnel where excellence in the acquisition field was rewarded with appropriate promotion and an opportunity. You think we've made any progress in that area?
I'm sorry, Mr. Andrews.
Our uniformed people.
Yep.
Very few of our uniformed people want to go in acquisition as a career because the rewards are not so great. We want to fix that and make it a desirable area. Have we done any progress on that?
It's hard for me to say because my understanding of the most recent acquisition workforce plan that came over here will focus largely on civilians and less so on the military and the contractors. But
thank you. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I may, that's one area I think we do want to focus on is that This is a joint effort between our civilians and our uniformed personnel. We want to be real. Mr. Conaway put in that law, as we did. We want to be sure that a good career path for a uniformed person is this as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the gentleman makes a great point. Ms. Archler.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up, Ms. Farrell, on your opening testimony and also my colleague, Mr. Kissel's question. I think it was the same area. You identified 3 areas out of 22, I believe, that you shared are needs, language, logistics, and information technology. Is that right?
Those were 3 areas that DOD had started their gap analysis on of their 22 mission critical occupations, the occupations that they had designated as mission critical.
Okay, very good. I wanted to ask Mr. Tamburino, do you have problems filling open positions right now? And if so, what are those positions and why do you think, if you do have problems?
Madam Congressman, thank you for that question. We don't have problems filling our vacancies right now. Mm-hmm. There are many, many applicants for all of our jobs. Our challenge is to respond to the GAO is absolutely right. They have asked us to do critical skill gap analysis. That takes quite a while, and I'm obligated to find a way to do that quicker. We want every person that comes to work for us to know from the day they start at the entry level to they go to the most senior level, this is the career path they can expect to follow. These are the functional skills we expect them to accrue, and these are the proficiency levels we expect them to have. That takes a lot of intense management, and we're making progress across more than 3 areas in that, but we agree we have to do a little bit more to show due diligence here.
How long do you think it would take for just, say, one of these jobs, say, let's take logistics, to write the proficiencies and to the skill levels that you need?
It takes dedication of senior leadership and several subject matter experts. I think it takes on the order of, I'd have to go back and check, but it's on the magnitude of months. But then there are surveys that we use with OPM to assess those, and we assess the entire workforce for what they actually do when they go to work in the morning, what skills, knowledges, and abilities they use. Those are much more complicated, and they take quite a while, and we're working with OPM on how to make that quicker, because those are complicated surveys at the detailed level of what a person does on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I'm a small business owner with my husband, and I've written job descriptions before, and I know this is beyond a job description, but it's hard for me to fathom and understand why it would take months to basically write a job description. It seems like the DOD needs more business-minded people and more business experience.
Yes, ma'am. Job descriptions are part of it. These are getting down to the skills they need, what training they need to accrue those skills, and what proficiency levels they must demonstrate. So we can write the job description pretty quickly, but getting to what does the person actually need to do when they sit at their desk, it almost varies by what service they're in and what occupation they're doing. So we have several communities that have done a really excellent job. Financial management community is a good place. Logistics is a good place, but it has taken them a long time to take the general domain of financial management and parse it across all the functions a financial manager does in the federal government. There are dozens of functions they do.
Do you presently have targets set that with these skill levels, we want to have this done by October? We're going to have this skill set description and done by November. Is there in-date goals that have been set on these things?
I'd like to take that specifically as a research question. Some there are, some we have to develop them. So I'd like to get back to you on that.
Yeah, because I think that's important in goal setting to get things done, and rather than just say we need to do a better job or we down the road we need to do it faster. Yes, Ms. Farrell.
In our February 2009 report before Mr. Tamburino, and it's one that I would refer him to, and we'd be happy to discuss these issues, we did make a recommendation that DOD develop a performance plan to help them move forward in the development to meet all of the legislative requirements. And we agree, if there's a if it's going to take years to do all 22 mission critical occupations, then what's the plan? And it's quite involved, as Mr. Tamburino was saying. It's identifying the skills, that's the first step, but then identifying, well, do you have needs today that are beyond what you have on board, besides what you need in the future? And it's from that you develop your gap analysis. And again, we keep coming back, the gap analysis is critical to have a roadmap to determine how to recruit, how to develop your people, how to train them, and those strategies must be flexible so they can adjust with emerging needs.
I would just say my final comment, it needs to be done quickly, or else by the time you get done, the skills will have changed that you need, and then you're just doing a perpetual loop. So, thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sorry that I missed your testimony earlier, and I'm trying to understand better what the appropriate mix of military, civilian, and contractors are, and whether you could take that into an example, perhaps. I'm sure this varies greatly by what people are doing, but I'm also wondering if there are some general ways of looking at that, and whether there's some assessment, sort of understanding and analyzing how that worked. You know, whether the skill sets that people are bringing are different, whether accountability measures are different for someone who's a civilian employee versus the military, oversight functions, and as well as contracting. Obviously, a contractor can be fired, I would assume. I don't know what their contract might say, but how does that work together, and what issues do you see around that? And what do we learn if we really try and study that? Has it been, and under what circumstances?
First, I'd like to say that GAO has done a lot of work in this area, but I have to preface my comments by saying it's hard to come up with a magical ratio of appropriate mix. We've done a lot of work looking at the use of, say, contractors as contract specialists, just to use an example. If you're in a situation, and that's considered a closely supporting inherently governmental function. From the work we've done, it's important that when an agency decides they want to use, say, a contractor for that type of activity, they got to stand back and say, okay, what is it exactly we want that contractor to do? Are we going to ask them to write statements of work? If you're going to write statements of work, what implications does that have downstream in terms of organizational conflicts if they're from a firm that wants to bid on that contract? Just to illustrate the point. If it's something that might be more plain vanilla of a contracting support, like supporting some administrative function or something like that, you still might want to ask yourself, and you should ask yourself, okay, if I ask the contractor to do that, they're going to be providing an input to some government official eventually that's going to have to make a decision. Will that government official know that that came from a contractor? If not, that presents risk. Will that government official be properly trained to understand the implications of what they're asking a contractor to do? If not, that's going to present risk to the government. And in those situations, when you're getting into riskier and riskier situations, you are putting the government at risk of losing government control and accountability over decision making. So there's no magical ratio, but I think you have to look at each individual decision. But to start, though, I think you still need some kind of strategic vision as to what you do or you may not want contractors to do for policy reasons.
Mm-hmm. Are there decisions made as well that I think would indicate over time that that's a function that should be brought essentially in-house? I mean, if we don't have those skill sets. I'm thinking even about medical needs within the military, going out to the civilian workforce, and then eventually having to contract because those skills aren't there. Clearly, in the world that we live in today, we don't have all the people that we could have in any of the services. But I'm just trying to get a handle, I think, on that decision-making process, and at what point those questions are asked, whether in fact truly those skills are not in-house, and again what the accountability is and how that differs in the way jobs are delivered themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll try to be brief, but I don't want to steal the thunder of DOD. Perhaps they have a view, but I still think you need a strategic vision and view of how you want to use, in this case we're talking about contractors. The Congress has been pushing and urging agencies to provide these inventories of service contracts. That's the first step. That's just getting a basic understanding how we're using contractors, to what extent we're using contractors, and then looking at them on an individual basis and saying, what do we ask them to do, and are we okay with that or not? Is it an enduring need? Is it episodic? Is it expertise? I mean, all these different factors come into play. But I think the inventory process ultimately is a tool that may help the agencies, particularly DOD, get a better handle on that workforce mix that you're talking about.
Madam Congressman, thanks for that question. The mix between military, civilian, and contract, as you said, is almost local. We have to, what is the mission on the ground for that local commander, and who does he need to perform that mission in terms of skill sets? I think if you're at the waterfront or on the ground deployed, it's principally military, and we understand that. If you're at a systems command or a buying command, I submit you're going to find mostly career civil servants, because that's an enduring proposition that needs a deep skill set in systems engineering, contract management, logistics management, financial management. The decision to award a service contract is generally predicated on, we're not going to need that skill set for an enduring period, so let's just buy the packet of work we need for that given moment in time, or we just don't have that skill in the government, and we don't need that skill in the government on an enduring basis. And that's how I think most local commanders go about making that decision. And I agree with the GAO. We take seriously this annual service contract inventory. And Dr. Stanley is putting a lot of emphasis on the amount of analysis that's going into that every year, so we can make an informed decision of what needs to stay inside the government because it's inherently governmental or closely aligned that way or more cost effective that way, and what can we take into the private sector, because that just represents a proposition we're able to deal with at that point in time.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us today. I appreciate your efforts and your enlightenment into what I think is probably one of the more challenging aspects of what all of us are going to have to deal with going in the future, especially in days of what I call resource challenges. So let me ask this. I want to pick up from where Ms. Davis left off, and that is the whole idea of the proper mix. As you look in the military, if you look at uniformed services, civilian, and contractors, there's been a lot of back and forth from insourcing to outsourcing and trying to find that right balance. And just as many of you have spoken about, it's trying to find out which fundamental elements of government truly need somebody in a government position. Where do we have need elsewhere? I want to make sure that there's the right balance there. The key, I think, going in the future is to have the adaptability and flexibility in workforce to meet changing needs. And let's face it, we're in a pretty dynamic world and a pretty dynamic area of resources. If we can't redirect pretty quickly to meet those needs, that's going to hurt us, and it also adds to cost. I think it takes away from our ability to be really efficient. Can you give me some indication as we go down the road, and there's been a lot of back and forth, as you know, in the whole debate about insourcing versus outsourcing, a certain number of positions being converted to the government side. Can you give me an indication about where you believe we need to be, and are we there with the construction of our federal workforce as it relates to defense matters? And if we're not, what do we need to do to make sure we have that right mix and that we can be flexible enough in making decisions in a fairly short time frame to make sure we have that right mix of human capital?
Mr. Congressman, thanks for that question. I think the Department of Defense efficiency initiatives launched us down that pathway. I think we were directed to critically examine our mission, prioritize the mission sets, and rid ourselves of functions we did not have a need to do anymore, because, as you said, we're headed into a resource-constrained environment. So it is a matter of each component looking at that mission set, deciding what's important, making that very critical decision of what they're not going to do anymore in a resource-constrained environment because it's duplicative, it doesn't add value, or it just doesn't fit with what we are being told to do as the nation's armed forces. And after that, it is literally making sure that the government has the core capabilities it needs to be an intelligent buyer of goods and services. And that's very enduring, and I think that's the point of the annual inventory of contract services. So I couldn't tell you where the balance point is, other than I can tell you it's a critical focus right now to try and figure that out and develop some kind of analytical tool that would help us predict that on an ongoing basis, which we don't frankly have right now.
Well, let me ask this on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being where you'd like to be in a perfect world. Where do you believe you are on that continuum of creating that right mix of workforce and human capital?
Sir, I think we have been working the Strategic Human Capital Plan for 3 years. Each year we've made progress. I think now we really do have a good sense of where we want to go. So I'd say I'm right in the middle. I have a good basis. I think we've done a great job with the acquisition workforce. I think we've done an exceptional job with our senior executives, the 1,300 or 1,400 of those in the department, and those are good launching pads. And I think several of our communities, financial management, logistics, and medical, are in very good standing. So I think we have a good line of sight of where we have to go right now.
Could you give just some indication, a time frame about when you think you would ultimately get to where you would like to be or where you need to be?
Sir, as I said in my oral statement, I've kind of benchmarked 2015 as being done. It's a large workforce of 780,000 people spanning greater than 600 unique job series. So it's got a large number of moving parts, but I have a tremendous obligation to get this right, and I take that very seriously.
Okay. Very good. Anybody else from the panel like to add their thoughts on that? Ms. Farrell?
We agree with Mr. Tamburino, but the very first thing, before you start talking about how do you use these tools such as insourcing and outsourcing, is to determine your needs. And we keep going back to the first step is to assess your existing needs, then assess what you need for the future, as well as what my colleague has pointed out about the inventory with the contract services. But first assess what your needs are, then look at what tools you have and what should be inside DOD and what should be going outside.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's continue along those lines, Ms. Farrell. On page 6 of your report, you make a reference to basically the DOD has to provide a metric for measuring progress toward DOD's goal of having a mission-ready workforce. I guess this reminds me of another hearing that we had when we were going over the 30-year shipbuilding plans of the Navy, and we happened to have 3 graduates before us of the Naval Academy, all graduated the same year, and it was 36 years ago. So I asked him, from where you sit today, would you have guessed 30 years ago what your needs were? And of course, they said no. I mean, you know, it's a dynamic process, and it's one that changes. I'm not defending the DOD, but the thing is that if you're holding them to a criteria of a mission-ready workforce, how are you going to know? How are they to know what the mission is going to be like 5 years, 10 years from now? And I can tell you, I represent Hawaii. Who would have thought that we would have gone from a conventional type of military to strikers, all within a period of 5 years? How are they to know? And what I also want you to answer to me is, it seems like if this requirement is put upon them and they can't project it, you almost seem to be proposing outsourcing, because then you don't have to have a military ready or a civilian workforce that can address things if you don't know what the mission is going to look like. I think we've seen in the past 10 years how different this mission is. So if you can comment to that.
Sure. I think it's DOD that has made the statement many times that you have a plan to make a plan. And we emphasize that the strategies contained in their workforce plan, when they develop them to meet their needs to be flexible in order to address emerging needs. It's actually the legislative requirement that mandates that DOD look forward 7 years starting the year after they submit their workforce plan to Congress. And it used to be 10 years. And there's a lot of debate about how far forward can an organization be without losing some sense of reality, and just along the lines of what you're saying. But there are emerging needs. Again, I'll use my example that I had earlier of traumatic brain injury that developed and it kept growing, and that was an emerging need several years ago, and it was the kind of need that needed to be built into the medical plan in order for the people to have the right medical provider. So there are emerging needs that when, like Mr. Tamburino talks about surveying for the existing, it's also a lot of knowledge about here's what's starting to break through, and it's going to be issues for DOD in the future.
I understand that, Ms. Farrow, and I understand that Congress in its wisdom thinks we're doing the right things a lot of time. But that's why we have you doing reports to tell us, you're off the mark. If you think that, we're asking the DOD to do something that they can't do, you should point it out. But it still begs the issue, which is that to define a mission ready, I can understand a trauma situation like that. But let's talk about mission ready. Basically, what type of workforce are we going to need, for example, for the shipyards, for anything else into the future when we are changing what they need to have the skills for? So civilian, for example. We may need welders today, but who knows whether that technology is going to change in 5 years, and what do we do? Should there be a component of retraining? Should there be an assessment? What is it that when you say mission ready workforce that you expect the DOD to be able to do when you made that statement?
I think that was their metric that they were using, saying that they would have a certain percentage mission ready.
So when you
but again, we believe in metrics. Whether it's congressionally mandated or not, we would believe that they need to have metrics for what they are trying to achieve. And we would believe that they need to look forward about their future workforce and what those needs are.
And that's my question. How do you determine, or how in your mind have they looked to the future workforce when we may not know what that future workforce is going to be like? You're almost like telling them, like the 30-year plan. It's like, okay, just put something out there and say, so if they did that, would they satisfy the quote-unquote, the metric by saying this is what we think it's going to be like and this is what we're doing?
Well, again, we want an assessment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. And I apologize for not being here earlier, but we have these conflicting schedules here. Having had the experience of serving in the Border Patrol and being a chief in the Border Patrol back in the 80s when the A-76 program first came out, and wanting to test the concept of contracting out services because it was going to save money, and having gone through that, which conclusively proved that it did not save money. We were a law enforcement agency, so we had a requirement of 24 hours, weekends, holidays, didn't matter. We found out very quickly that we were limited in terms of after hours because it would affect the budget that had been set up for the A-76 contract. We were limited in terms of vehicles, patrol vehicles that broke down unexpectedly, and we would have to wait until the contract hours kicked in, which were normally between 8 and 5 during the day, which meant we had to make a decision whether or not we left the vehicle in isolated areas where it could be vandalized or compromised or some other way. So there are many, many issues like that that came up in that process that we quickly determined, hey, A-76 may work someplace else, but it sure doesn't work in the law enforcement area. Having had that experience and then having gone through the experience of largely contracting out huge portions of the effort in Iraq and to a lesser degree in Afghanistan, I think at least my opinion, what I have learned through this process is that contracting out isn't all it's cracked out to be. And then I try to mitigate that with my experience when I was in the Army, having had to pull KP. It would have been nice to have contracted out the kitchen duties and all of those kinds of things. So in today's world, with the kinds of challenges that I think members have articulated here, and the kinds of things that we're trying to do to try to maximize efficiency and hold down cost, it really is a guessing game because we don't know what requirements of the workforce are going to be in 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years. So studies done about the things that have worked and the things that haven't worked, where there's got to be a balance or a mixture of federal employees to contract employees is very important. And one, Mr. Chairman, I know you and I have discussed it, that we don't want to just jump off and do without making sure we know exactly, or at least we think we know what the results are going to be. But it's always important to look at history to be able to make those informed decisions. Being a 26-and-a-half-year federal employee, obviously I have great respect for the institutional knowledge, the dedication, the professionalism that federal employees bring to the process. Nothing against contract employees, but federal employees have a vested interest in a career where they're counting on, where they're counted on to carry out the mission, wherever that mission takes them. In today's world, the other thing we have to consider is that we're facing asymmetric threats that make it necessary for DOD and intelligence to work closer and closer together, which makes it imperative, I think, that we put in the mix the kinds of duties that would be risk jobs, high-risk jobs that can't be done readily by contractors. So I hope all of these things we can take into account. I definitely want to thank you for the work that you do in this area, but I think we're a long ways from finding that right balance or that right combination. I think there's much more work to be done, so I hope we're able to continue in a much slower pace, so that like that old rule of the carpenter, measure twice and cut once, because it's expensive if you don't. We learned that in the Iraq War. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all again.
I'm still trying to figure out why you wanted to contract out KP.
Oh, because I hated getting up at 3.
Start peeling those potatoes. Well, we didn't run into the problem I was concerned about. The members all had an opportunity to ask their questions and still make their votes. So thank you very much for being here, and with that, the committee will stand adjourned.